The dying light of day cast long shadows across the Sacramento mountains, painting the high ridges in shades of copper and violet. Down in the forested slopes, where the air hung thick with the scent of pine resin and summer dust, twilight whispered of both beauty and danger. 7-year-old Jake Monroe had never meant to stray so far from the other boys. But curiosity had always been his weakness, and on this particular evening it might prove his doom. The rabbit had been so close, its white tail flashing like a beacon through the undergrowth. Jake's small boots crunched over fallen pine needles as he followed the creature deeper into the timber, and the laughter of his playmates growing fainter behind him. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, the forest had swallowed their voices entirely. A chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air crept up Jake's spine. He turned in a slow circle, his wide brown eyes searching for any familiar landmark. Nothing. The towering pines rose around him, like the pillars of some ancient cathedral, their branches creaking in the evening breeze, with sounds that made his heart skip. Overhead, the first pale stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Billy Tommy. His voice came out smaller than he'd intended, barely more than a whisper. The forest seemed to swallow the sound, without echo. Jake cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Hey, where'd you all go?" Silence stretched around him, broken only by the whisper of wind through the needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the canopy. Jake's chest tightened. Mama always said he was braver than most boys his age. But standing alone in the gathering darkness, her words felt as distant as her warm embrace. He chose what looked like the most worn path and started walking, his small hand instinctively moving to the bone handle of the pocket knife his mother had given him for his last birthday. It wasn't much, barely longer than his palm, and dulled from years of cutting fishing line and whittling sticks, but it was something. The weight of it against his leg gave him just enough courage to keep moving. The trail forked ahead, then forked again. Each choice seemed more impossible than the last. Jake's breath began to come in short puffs as panic clawed at the edges of his mind. The shadows grew deeper, and with them came sounds he couldn't identify, rustling in the undergrowth, the crack of a branch somewhere behind him and underneath it all. A low rumbling that might have been distant thunder. Then he heard it, a long, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth itself. Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He'd heard wolves before, of course, everyone in Willow Creek had. But hearing them from the safety of his mother's kitchen was one thing. Out here alone and small and defenseless, their voices carried a different meaning entirely. Another howl answered the first, closer this time, then another. Jake broke into a run, his boots slipping on loose pine needles and hidden stones. Branches caught at his clothes and scratched his face, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, he could hear movement at the soft pad of feet on forest floor, keeping pace with his panicked flight. The trees suddenly opened into a small clearing where the last golden light of sunset pooled like honey. Jake stumbled into the open space, gasping for breath, and allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe he could see the lights of town from here. Maybe. Movement at the edge of the timber froze him in place. 3 wolves emerged from the shadows, like ghosts made flesh. Their gray coats seemed to absorb what little light remained, and their yellow eyes reflected it back with an otherworldly gleam. The largest of the 3, a massive male with scars crisscrossing his muzzle, lowered his head and took a step forward. His lips peeled back to reveal teeth that gleamed white as fresh snow. Jake's hand fumbled for his pocket knife, but his fingers were shaking so badly he could barely grip the handle. "Stay back," he whispered, though he doubted the wolves understood English or cared if they did. "Please just stay back." The lead wolf crept closer, his powerful shoulders rolling with each step. The other 2 began to circle, cutting off any hope of escape. Jake pressed his back against a large boulder, feeling the rough stone cold against his spine through his thin shirt. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them away. Crying wouldn't help him now. The big wolf gathered himself to spring. The sharp crack of a rifle split the evening air. The bullet struck the ground inches from the wolf's front paws, kicking up a spray of dirt and pine needles. The animal recoiled with a startled snarl, his yellow eyes swinging toward the source of the shot. A voice rang out from the timber deep, commanding speaking words in a language Jake had never heard before. Another shot followed this one even closer to the circling wolves. They whined and backed away, their ears flattened against their skulls. The voice spoke again, and this time Jake caught the tone, if not the meaning, a warning that brooked no argument. The wolves looked between the hidden marksmen and their potential prey for a long moment that stretched like eternity. Then, as if responding to some signal Jake couldn't perceive, they melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared. Jake's legs gave out beneath him. He would have collapsed entirely if not for the strong hands that caught him under his arms, steadying him against a broad chest that smelled of wood smoke and leather. "Easy, boy," a deep voice said, this time in accented English. "They're gone now. You're safe." Jake looked up into the face of his rescuer and felt his breath catch. The man was tall and powerfully built, his skin darkened by years under the desert sun. Long black hair hung loose to his shoulders, held back only by a strip of raw hide. His features were sharp and angular, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths Jake couldn't fathom. He wore buckskin trousers and a faded blue cavalry coat, with the sleeves cut off, revealing muscular arms marked with old scars. A bow was slung across his back, and Jake could see the feathered ends of arrows protruding from a quiver at his hip. But it was the rifle in his hands, still smoking from the recent shots, that had saved Jake's life. You saved me," Jake managed to say through chattering teeth. The man nodded gravely. "My name is Ross Nez." His voice carried the cadence of someone more comfortable with solitude than conversation. But there was gentleness in it, too. "What's yours, boy?" Jake Monroe." The words tumbled out in a rush, relief making him almost giddy. At the mention of that surname, something shifted in Ross's expression. His dark eyes sharpened, studying Jake's face with new intensity. The boy's features, the shape of his eyes, even the way he held his head, all of it stirred memories Ross had spent 7 years trying to bury. Monroe, the name echoed in his mind like a stone dropped into a deep well. Ross forced himself to speak normally. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Jake Monroe. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. I didn't mean to get lost." Jake said, shame coloring his voice. "I was just following a rabbit, and then I couldn't find the other boys, and then—" He gestured vaguely toward where the wolves had disappeared. Despite everything, Ross found himself almost smiling. Rabbits can be tricksters. They lead a man exactly where they want him to go. He shouldered his rifle and extended a calloused hand. "Come on. Let's get you home before full dark." Jake hesitated for only a moment before slipping his small palm into Ross's larger one. The Apache's grip was firm and warm, and for the first time since he'd realized he was lost, Jake felt truly safe. "Can you really take me home?" Jake asked as they started down a game trail that seemed to lead toward the valley. Ross looked toward the distant lights of Willow Creek, just beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Home for the boy, it meant safety and his mother's arms. For Ross, it meant walking back into a world that had made its feelings about men like him abundantly clear. But the child's trust was absolute, and Ross found he couldn't disappoint it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll take you home." They walked together through the deepening night, Jake chattering nervously about his mother and their little house on the edge of town, while Ross listened and tried to prepare himself for what was coming. Because with each mention of Mama and Dora Monroe, his heart beat a little faster, and the old wound in his chest, the one he thought had healed over with scar tissue, began to ache again. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. 7 years ago, he had ridden away from Willow Creek, and Dora Monroe convinced he was protecting her from a life of hardship and prejudice. Now he was walking back toward that same town, led by a boy who bore his eyes and Dora's stubborn chin, a boy who couldn't possibly exist unless— Ross pushed the thought away. Coincidences happened. The world was full of them. But even as he told himself this, he couldn't stop studying Jake's profile in the starlight, couldn't stop seeing echoes of his own features in the child's face. The trail wound downward through stands of aspen and oak, their leaves rustling like whispered secrets in the night breeze. Jake had grown quieter as they walked, his earlier chatter giving way to the comfortable silence of exhaustion. When they finally emerged from the timber onto the sage-dotted hills that surrounded Willow Creek, the boy's steps quickened with recognition. "There," he said, pointing toward a small cabin that sat slightly apart from the main cluster of buildings. "That's our house. See the light in the window? Mama always keeps it burning when I'm out late." Ross saw it, a warm yellow glow that seemed to beckon across the darkness. His throat tightened. How many nights had he dreamed of that light? How many times had he imagined himself walking up that path, knocking on that door, finding forgiveness waiting on the other side? But he had forfeited that right 7 years ago when he'd chosen fear over love. Jake broke away from him and ran the last few yards to the cabin, his boots thudding on the packed earth of the yard. "Mama, Mama, I'm home." The door flew open before Ross had taken another step. A woman stood silhouetted in the lamplight, slender with pale hair that caught the glow like spun gold. Even at this distance, even after all these years, Ross would have known her anywhere. The way she moved, the tilt of her head when she was listening, and the graceful line of her neck, all of it was burned into his memory like a brand. "Jake." Dora Monroe dropped to her knees on the porch and gathered the boy into her arms, holding him so tightly it seemed she might never let him go. "Oh, my baby, I was so worried. When the other boys came back without you." Her voice broke, and Ross could see her shoulders shaking with relief. Jake squirmed in his mother's embrace, trying to point back toward the dark figure waiting near the gate. "Mama, I met someone. He saved me from wolves, real wolves, and he brought me home safe." Dora's grip on her son loosened slightly. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her gaze toward the shadows where Ross stood. The lamplight from the open door reached just far enough to illuminate his face, and Ross heard her sharp intake of breath echo across the quiet yard. Ross. His name fell from her lips like a prayer and a curse combined, barely more than a whisper, but carrying the weight of 7 years' worth of unanswered questions. He felt that single word hit him like a physical blow. All the speeches he'd rehearsed during lonely nights on the trail, all the explanations and apologies he'd crafted, they crumbled to dust in his throat. "Hello, Dora." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The years fell away, like autumn leaves revealing the raw truth beneath. They were still the same two people who had once loved each other with a passion that seemed strong enough to overcome any obstacle. And they were also the same two people who had discovered that love, no matter how deep, sometimes wasn't enough. Jake looked between them with growing confusion. "Mama, do you know him?" Dora's laugh was shaky-edged with something that might have been hysteria. "Yes, Jake, I know him." She stood slowly, her hand still resting on her son's shoulder, as if anchoring herself to reality. "This man, his name is Ross Nez, and he's your father." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Jake's mouth fell open, his dark eyes, so like Ross's own, widening with wonder and disbelief. My father. But I thought—" "I know what you thought," Dora said softly, her gaze never leaving Ross's face. "I know what I told you. That he was gone. That he wasn't coming back." Her voice hardened. "And I wasn't wrong, was I, Ross? 7 years. 7 years of silence while I raised our son alone, while I faced the whispers and the stares and the judgment of this entire town. And now you just appear like nothing happened." Ross took a step closer, his hands held open at his sides. I didn't come looking for you, Dora. I swear on my ancestors' graves I didn't know. The boy was lost in the mountains. Wolves were about to. He gestured helplessly. I couldn't just walk away, like you did before. The words cracked like a whip across the night air. Jake tugged at his mother's skirt, his young voice cutting through the tension. Mama, don't be angry. He saved me. The wolves were going to eat me, and he made them go away with his rifle. He's a hero. Ross knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking, not just in their features, but in the way Jake held himself, the stubborn tilt of his chin when he was making a point. I'm no hero, son. I'm just a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But you are my pa. Jake pressed as if the word held some kind of magic. Ross looked up at Dora, seeking permission he wasn't sure he deserved. She gave a slight nod, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Yes, Ross said simply. I am. Jake studied him for a long moment, taking in the buckskin clothing, the long hair, the weathered features that spoke of years spent under the open sky. Does that make me half Apache? A smile tugged at the corner of Ross's mouth, and the first genuine expression of happiness he'd felt in years. It makes you all mine, Jake. Apache, white, or anything else. What matters is that you're brave and good, and you have your mother's heart. The boy beamed at this, but Dora's expression remained guarded. You can't just walk back into our lives like this, Ross. This town, these people, they haven't forgotten what you are, what we were, what that makes Jake. I know. Ross rose to his feet, suddenly feeling every one of his 32 years. I'm not asking for anything, Dora. If you'll let me, I'd like to stay nearby. To watch over the boy. To help if you'll have it. And if I say no, Ross was quiet for a long moment, looking at Jake, then at the woman he'd never stopped loving. Then I'll go. But I won't abandon him again, Dora. I won't abandon either of you. Not like I did before. Jake stepped between them, his small face serious beyond his years. Please don't make him go away, Mama. I just found him. Dora closed her eyes, and Ross could see the war being fought behind her lids, between hurt and hope, between caution and longing. When she opened them again, some of the hardness had softened. There's a line shack about 2 miles north of here, she said finally. Old Pete Hawkins used to winter there before he died. It's not much, but it's shelter. She looked directly at Ross. You can use it, for now. But if you hurt him, if you disappear again. I won't, Ross said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As if to seal the promise, Jake suddenly threw his arms around Ross's waist, hugging him with the fierce enthusiasm that only children could muster. Ross stiffened in surprise, then slowly, carefully brought his arms around the boy's small frame. Thank you for saving me. Pa, Jake whispered against his chest. Ross closed his eyes and held his son, a little tighter. Thank you for letting me. The next few days passed in a strange sort of dance between hope and uncertainty. Ross took up residence in the abandoned line shack, cleaning out years of dust and cobwebs, patching holes in the roof, and making the small space livable again. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a stone fireplace, and a single window that looked out toward the distant lights of Willow Creek, but it was the first real home he'd had since leaving the reservation. Jake visited every afternoon after finishing his chores, usually arriving breathless and excited, bursting with questions about everything from Apache customs to the best way to track a deer through rocky terrain. Ross answered patiently, marveling at the boy's quick mind and eager curiosity. In Jake's eyes, he saw none of the fear or suspicion that usually greeted his kind in white settlements. There was only the innocent acceptance of a child who had waited 7 years to meet his father and wasn't about to waste a moment of their time together. Dora remained more cautious. She would appear sometimes at the edge of the clearing where Ross was teaching Jake to identify animal tracks or demonstrating how to string a bow. She never stayed long, and she never spoke directly to Ross, but he could feel her watching, evaluating, trying to decide whether this man who had broken her heart once could be trusted with her sons. The town, meanwhile, buzzed with whispers. Willow Creek was small enough that secrets were impossible to keep, and the sight of Jake Monroe walking hand in hand with an Apache warrior was the kind of gossip that spread faster than wildfire. Most of the talk was merely curious. Who was this Indian? Where had he come from? What was his connection to the Monroe family? But some of it carried a darker undertone, especially among the men who gathered at Briggs's saloon to nurse their drinks and their grievances. Harlan Briggs himself was the loudest voice among them. A big man with shoulders like an ox and a temper to match Harlan had been nursing a grudge against Dora Monroe for the better part of a decade. He'd courted her once back when they were both young and the future seemed full of possibilities. But Dora had politely declined his advances, and that rejection had festered in his heart like an infected wound. Now, with Ross's return, all of Harlan's old resentments came bubbling back to the surface. "Midan, I seen him," Harlan declared to anyone who would listen, slamming his whiskey glass down on the bar with enough force to rattle the bottles. "That Apache strutting around like he owns the place, corrupting that boy with his heathen ways. And Dora Monroe just lets it happen, shameless as you please." A few of the other drinkers muttered their agreement, but most shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was something unsettling about the venom in Harlan's voice, the way his eyes glittered with malice when he spoke about Ross and Dora. "Now hold on, Harlan," said Doc Henley, the town physician, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "From what I hear, that Apache saved young Jake from a pack of wolves. Seems to me we ought to be grateful, not looking for trouble." "Grateful." Harlan's voice rose to a roar. "For what? For bringing his savage ways into our town, for reminding everyone of Dora Monroe's shame." He leaned across the bar, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. "That boy's a half-breed bastard, and his father's nothing but a dirty Indian who ought to be run out of town on a rail." The saloon fell silent. Even the piano player stopped mid-song, his hands frozen over the keys. Doc Henley stood up slowly, his usually gentle expression hardening into something resembling steel. "That's enough, Harlan. That boy you're talking about is 7 years old, and he's done nothing to deserve your hate. Neither has his mother, for that matter. His mother spread her legs for a savage." Harlan snarled. "If that ain't shame, I don't know what is." This time, it was Sheriff Tom Cobb who responded, rising from his corner table with the deliberate movements of a man who'd broken up more than his share of saloon fights. "You'll watch your tongue when you speak about the Lady Briggs, and you'll keep your grievances to yourself or you'll answer to me." Harlan glared at the sheriff, but even in his drunken state, he wasn't foolish enough to challenge Tom Cobb directly. The man had been keeping the peace in Willow Creek for 15 years, and his reputation with a 6-gun was well earned. "Fine," Harlan muttered, turning back to his drink. "But mark my words, no good will come of this. That Indian brings trouble wherever he goes. You'll see." As the conversations gradually resumed and the piano player found his rhythm again, Harlan continued to brood over his whiskey. But now, his mutterings were too quiet for anyone else to hear, and his eyes held a calculating gleam that would have worried anyone who knew him well. 3 weeks after Ross's return, Jake fell ill. It started with a cough, nothing unusual for a 7-year-old boy who spent most of his time outdoors, especially with autumn settling over the mountains and the nights growing cold. But the cough persisted, growing deeper and more frequent, until Jake was doubled over with fits that left him gasping for breath. Dora tried all the usual remedies: willow bark tea for the fever, hot compresses for his chest, even the patent medicine she'd bought from a traveling salesman the previous spring. Nothing helped. If anything, Jake seemed to be getting worse. On the 4th night, his fever spiked dangerously high. Dora sat beside his bed, bathing his flushed face with cool water and whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since she was a child. Jake tossed and turned in his delirium, calling out for his father in between fits of coughing. Ross arrived at dawn, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. He found Dora slumped in her chair, exhausted and frightened, while Jake lay pale and still beneath his blankets. "How long has he been like this?" Ross asked, his voice tight with concern. "All night." Dora's voice was hoarse from crying. "I don't know what else to do, Ross. I've tried everything I can think of, but nothing works. He's so hot and he can barely breathe." Ross knelt beside the bed and placed a gentle hand on Jake's forehead. The boy's skin was burning, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Ross had seen this kind of sickness before in the Apache camps during the harsh winters. Sometimes the sufferers recovered on their own. Sometimes they didn't. "He needs more help than we can give him here," Ross said quietly. "Real medicine, a warm house, people who know how to fight this kind of fever." Dora looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you saying?" "Your parents, Dora. The Monroes have the biggest house in town, the best heating connections to real doctors. They know." Dora's voice cracked like a whip. "I haven't spoken to them in 7 years, Ross. Not since—" She gestured helplessly between them. "They made their feelings about our situation very clear. That was about us," Ross said firmly. "This is about Jake. He's their grandson, whether they acknowledge it or not. And right now, he's dying." The brutal honesty of those words hit Dora like a physical blow. She looked down at her son's pale face, at the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his small chest struggled with each breath, and knew Ross was right. "They'll never let you in the house," she said weakly. "Then I'll wait outside. But I won't leave Dora. Not while he needs me." An hour later, they were walking up the cobblestone path to the Grand Monroe house on Elm Street. It was the finest residence in Willow Creek, 2 stories of white-painted clapboard with black shutters and a wraparound porch that spoke of prosperity and respectability. Dora had grown up in this house, but now it seemed as foreign and forbidding as a fortress. Jake was wrapped in blankets and cradled in Ross's arms, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Ross had insisted on carrying the boy, and Dora was too exhausted to argue. Besides, there was something oddly comforting about watching her son rest against his father's broad chest, as if some ancient genetic memory told Jake he was safe there. Dora hesitated at the front door, her hand raised to knock. 7 years of silence stretched between her and the people on the other side of that polished oak panel, 7 years of hurt and pride and stubbornness on both sides. "Dora." Ross's voice was gentle but insistent. "He's burning up. We don't have time for old wounds." She nodded and knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and elegant despite the early hour. Margaret Monroe had aged since Dora had last seen her, but her blue eyes were still sharp and intelligent. Those eyes widened now as they took in the scene on her doorstep, her daughter looking haggard and desperate. A tall Apache warrior holding a small bundle, and beneath the blankets, the flushed face of a child she had never met but somehow recognized. "Dora." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Mother." Dora's composure finally cracked. "This is Jake, my son, your grandson. He's very sick and I don't know where else to turn." Margaret Monroe stared at the child in Ross's arms, and Dora could see the war of emotions playing across her face, surprise, longing, joy, and yes, love. All tangled together with 7 years of hurt and stubborn pride. But when Jake stirred restlessly and coughed a sound so weak and pitiful it would have broken a stone heart, grandmotherly instinct won out over everything else. "Bring him inside," Margaret said, stepping back from the door. "Quickly, before someone sees." They hurried into the spacious foyer where a grandfather clock chimed the hour, and family portraits looked down from the walls with stern, judgmental eyes. Margaret led them toward the front parlor, but heavy footsteps on the staircase made them all freeze. Margaret, what's all the commotion?" Robert Monroe appeared at the top of the stairs, still in his nightshirt and robe, but every inch the intimidating patriarch Dora remembered from her childhood. He was a big man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that had made grown men squirm in business negotiations. Those eyes now swept over the scene in his foyer with growing comprehension and anger. "Dora." His voice could have frozen fire. "What is the meaning of this?" "Our grandson is sick, Robert." Margaret said, her own voice gaining strength. "Desperately sick. And I'll not turn away a child in need, no matter what foolish pride. Our grandson." Robert's gaze fixed on Ross with unmistakable hostility. "You mean her bastard half-breed child, and she's brought the savage right into our home?" Ross tensed his jaw, tightening, but he said nothing. Jake's welfare was more important than his own pride. It was Dora who answered, her voice shaking with emotion. "His name is Jake, Father. He's 7 years old and he's dying. If you have even an ounce of Christian charity left in your heart, don't you dare lecture me about charity," Robert thundered, starting down the stairs. "You're the one who brought shame on this family. You're the one who—" His words cut off abruptly as Jake stirred in Ross's arms and opened his eyes. The boy's gaze, bright with fever, but unmistakably alert, fixed on the angry old man, with curious interest. "Are you my grandpa?" Jake asked in a voice like rustling leaves. The simple question hit Robert Monroe like a punch to the gut. He stopped mid-step, staring down at the child, at the familiar curve of his cheekbones, so like Dora's, and the dark eyes that held depths beyond his years. This wasn't some abstract concept anymore, some shameful secret to be hidden away. This was a real child, sick and vulnerable, and looking at him with innocent trust. Robert's voice failed him. Jake coughed, then a sound that seemed to tear through his small frame, and Ross instinctively tightened his hold on the boy. "Please," Ross said quietly, speaking directly to Robert for the first time. "Whatever you think of me, don't punish the child for it. He needs help." For a long moment, the foyer was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and Jake's labored breathing. Then Margaret stepped forward and gently took the boy from Ross's arms. "Come along, sweetheart," she said to Jake, her voice soft with newfound tenderness. "Let's get you warm and comfortable. Grandmother's going to take good care of you." As she carried Jake toward the parlor, Robert remained frozen on the stairs, watching his wife become a grandmother before his eyes. Dora moved to follow them, but paused at the foot of the staircase. "Thank you," she said quietly to her father. Robert looked down at her, this daughter he disowned 7 years ago. And for the first time since that terrible argument, he saw not defiance, but vulnerability. Dora was no longer the headstrong girl who had chosen love over family approval. She was a mother, frightened and desperate, willing to swallow her pride for her child's sake. "Don't thank me yet," he said gruffly. But his voice had lost its earlier venom. For the next 3 days, the Monroe house became a fortress of care and concern. Margaret threw herself into nursing her grandson with an energy that belied her age, bringing cool compresses for his fever-spooning broth between his lips, when he was lucid enough to swallow, and singing lullabies she remembered from Dora's own childhood. Dora rarely left Jake's side, catching what sleep she could in the chair beside his bed. The fever had broken on the 2nd day, but Jake remained weak and listless, his small body still fighting off whatever infection had taken hold in his lungs. Ross waited outside as he'd promised he would. He'd made a small camp in the grove of oak trees behind the Monroe house, where he could keep watch without offending the neighbors' sensibilities. Margaret brought him food and coffee, defying her husband's grumbling protests, and sometimes she would give him updates on Jake's condition. But mostly he simply waited, listening for the sound of his son's voice and praying to whatever spirits might be listening that the boy would recover. On the fourth morning, Jake woke with clear eyes and demanded to know where his pa was. "He's outside, sweetheart," Margaret said, smoothing the boy's hair back from his forehead. "He's been keeping watch over you." "Can I see him?" Jake asked, struggling to sit up in bed. Dora helped prop him up with pillows, relieved beyond words, to see color returning to his cheeks. "Are you sure you're strong enough? I want to see Pa," Jake said with a stubborn determination that both his parents recognized as their own. "Please, Mama." So it was that Ross came to be sitting beside his son's bed in the Monroe family parlor, holding Jake's small hand, while the boy chattered excitedly about his dreams and the really nice food his grandmother had been giving him. Robert Monroe stood in the doorway, watching this scene unfold. He'd spent the last 4 days struggling with emotions. He hadn't expected to feel love for a grandson. He'd never acknowledged admiration for a daughter who'd raised that grandson alone, and something approaching respect for the Apache warrior who'd brought them all together. "A boy's got strong blood," Robert said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Takes after his grandmother." Ross looked up at him, surprised by the almost compliment. "He takes after his mother. She's the strongest person I know." Robert harumphed at this, but Dora caught the way his expression softened slightly. Progress, she thought. Slow and grudging, but progress nonetheless. That evening, as Jake slept peacefully for the first time in days, Dora and Ross sat together on the front porch. The night was cool and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. For the first time since Ross's return, they were truly alone, without the distraction of Jake's illness or the weight of family expectations. "He's going to be all right." Dora said as much to convince herself as to inform Ross. "Yes, he is. He's tough like his mother." Dora glanced at him, noting the way the starlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. "When did you get so old, Ross Nez?" "When I started living with regret." His answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the town settling down to sleep. Finally, Dora spoke the words that had been burning in her heart for days. "Why did you really leave?" Ross was quiet for so long that Dora thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was a coward. Because your father threatened to disown you if you married me, and I believed him when he said you'd be better off without me. Because I thought love was enough to overcome anything, and when I realized it wasn't, I didn't know what else to do. You could have fought for us." "I should have fought for us," Ross corrected. "But I was 25 years old and scared out of my mind. I'd already lost my tribe, my land, everything that made me who I was. The thought of being responsible for you losing your family, too." He shook his head. "I convinced myself that walking away was noble, self-sacrificing. It took me 7 years to realize it was just cowardice dressed up in pretty words." Dora felt tears prick at her eyes. "Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the shame or the whispers or even raising Jake alone. It was that you never said goodbye. You just vanished, like what we had meant nothing." Ross turned to face her fully, and in the starlight, she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. "It meant everything, Dora. That's why I had to go. Because if I'd tried to say goodbye, I never would have been able to leave. And I thought, God help me, I thought leaving was the right thing to do. And now I know that the right thing to do is whatever keeps our family together. And if that means facing down every man in this town who has a problem with what I am, then so be it." As if summoned by his words, the sound of boots on gravel drifted up from the street. Both Dora and Ross tensed as they recognized the heavy, deliberate gait of men who'd been drinking and were looking for trouble. "Well, well, well." Harlan Briggs's voice carried clearly in the night air. Looks like the happy family's having a reunion. Ross stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. Behind Harlan, he could make out at least 5 other figures, more than enough to cause serious trouble, if that's what they were after. Evening, Harlan. Dora said, her voice carefully neutral. Bit late for a social call, isn't it? Harlan spat in the dirt, his eyes never leaving Ross. Heard tell the half-breed boy was sick. Thought we'd come by to offer our condolences. Jake's recovering nicely, thank you. Dora replied coldly. No need for your concern. Oh, but there is, Harlan said, taking a step closer to the porch. See, some of us have been talking, and we've decided this town's got a problem. A big Indian-shaped problem that needs solving. Ross moved to the edge of the porch, putting himself between Harlan and Dora. If you've got a grievance with me, Briggs, let's settle it man to man. Leave the lady out of it. Harlan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Oh, I got plenty of grievances with you, Apache. But my biggest problem ain't with you, it's with her. He pointed at Dora with one thick finger. She's the one who brought shame on this town. She's the one who spread her legs for a savage and then had the gall to raise his bastard spawn like it was something to be proud of. The words hit Ross like physical blows, but before he could respond, the front door of the Monroe house burst open. Robert Monroe stepped onto the porch, and in his hands was a double-barreled shotgun that looked like it had seen plenty of use. That's enough. The old man roared, his voice carrying all the authority of a lifetime spent commanding respect. I'll not have drunken trash disturbing the peace on my street, and I sure as hell won't have you speaking about my daughter and grandson in that tone. Harlan took an involuntary step backward, his eyes fixed on the shotgun's twin barrels. Your daughter, your grandson. Last I heard, you disowned the whore and her half-breed. The shotgun's hammers clicked back with sounds like breaking bones. The next man who uses that word in reference to my family, Robert said in a voice like winter wind, will be picking buckshot out of his hide for the next month. Are we clear? For a long moment the street was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the oak trees. Then one of Harlan's companions, a thin man named Perkins, tugged at the bigger man's sleeve. Come on, Harlan, this ain't worth getting shot over. But Harlan shook him off, his eyes still fixed on Ross with burning hatred. This ain't over, Apache. Not by a long shot. You think you can just waltz back into town and play house? You think people are going to forget what you are just because the old man's decided to claim his half-breed grandson? I think, Ross said quietly, that people can change. And I think a man who holds on to hate as long as you have is more to be pitied than feared. The words stung Harlan like a slap across the face. With a roar of rage, he lunged forward, but Ross was ready for him. The Apache moved with fluid grace, sidestepping Harlan's clumsy charge and driving his fist hard into the bigger man's solar plexus. Harlan doubled over, gasping for breath, and Ross followed up with an uppercut that snapped his head back and sent him crashing into the dirt. The other men started forward, but the sound of Robert's shotgun being cocked again stopped them in their tracks. I believe Mr. Briggs has had enough education for one evening, the old man said mildly. Why don't you boys help him home before he embarrasses himself further? Grumbling and casting dark looks over their shoulders, Harlan's companions hauled their leader to his feet and half carried him away into the darkness. When their footsteps had faded, Robert carefully lowered the hammers on his shotgun. Well, he said as if nothing unusual had happened. I believe I'll have a drink before bed. Anyone care to join me? It was Dora realized the first time her father had ever invited Ross into his house. The confrontation with Harlan Briggs marked a turning point in Willow Creek's attitude toward the reunited family. Word of Robert Monroe's defense of his daughter and grandson spread quickly through the town, and with it came a grudging acceptance that perhaps the situation wasn't as scandalous as some had believed. Not everyone was convinced, of course. There were still whispers in the mercantile and sideways glances at church on Sunday. But the whispers were quieter now, and the glances held more curiosity than condemnation. The fact that Jake was clearly a bright, well-mannered child helped considerably. It was hard to maintain that his parentage was shameful when he himself was so obviously a credit to his upbringing. Ross, meanwhile, found himself cautiously welcomed into the edges of Willow Creek society. Sheriff Cobb made a point of nodding to him when their paths crossed, and Doc Henley even stopped to chat about the weather one afternoon. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was a start. The real change, however, was in the Monroe household itself. What had begun as a crisis brought on by Jake's illness had evolved into something resembling a genuine reconciliation. Margaret Monroe doted on her grandson, with the enthusiasm of a woman making up for lost time, while Robert, though still gruff and occasionally disapproving, couldn't seem to resist Jake's innocent charm. And slowly, carefully, Dora and Ross began to rebuild what they had lost. It started with shared meals at the Monroe house, Jake chattering happily between his parents, while his grandparents looked on with expressions of bemused contentment. Then came long walks through the town and up into the foothills, Jake skipping ahead, while Dora and Ross talked about everything and nothing, his years of wandering, her struggles as a single mother, their hopes and fears for their son's future. One evening in late October, as they sat by the creek that gave the town its name, Jake announced that he wanted to learn Indian stuff from his father. "What kind of Indian stuff?" Ross asked, smiling at his son's terminology. "You know, tracking and hunting and talking to animals and making medicine and all that." Ross glanced at Dora, who nodded encouragingly. "Well," he said, "I can teach you to track, and I can show you which plants are good for healing. But I should probably mention that Indians don't actually talk to animals." Jake's face fell. "They don't?" "No, but we do listen to them. And if you listen carefully enough, you can learn to understand what they're telling you." "Like what?" Ross picked up a handful of pine needles and let them fall through his fingers. "Like which way the wind is blowing and whether it's going to rain tomorrow. Like whether there are predators nearby or if the hunting will be good. Like whether strangers are coming and whether they mean to cause trouble." Jake's eyes grew wide. "Can you teach me that?" "If you're willing to learn patience along with everything else. Listening takes time, and most people don't want to take the time anymore." "I will," Jake said earnestly. "I'll be the most patient person ever." Ross laughed, the sound carrying across the water like music. "We'll see about that." As autumn deepened into winter, the lessons began in earnest. Ross taught Jake to identify animal tracks in the snow, to read the signs that told of a storm approaching from the high peaks, to move through the forest without making a sound. In return, Jake shared the world of Willow Creek with his father, introducing him to shopkeepers and neighbors, proudly explaining Apache customs to anyone who would listen, building bridges between two worlds that had seemed irreconcilably different. By Christmas, even the town's children had accepted Jake's unique heritage. They peppered him with questions about his father's warrior skills and begged Ross to tell them stories about life in the mountains. Ross, who had spent years avoiding human contact, found himself surrounded by curious youngsters every time he came to town. "You're good with them," Dora observed one snowy afternoon as they watched Ross demonstrate the proper way to string a bow for a group of fascinated 8-year-olds. "Children don't see differences the way adults do," Ross replied. "To them, I'm just Jake's pa who knows interesting things. It's only when they get older that they learn to hate." "Maybe that's changing," Dora said hopefully. Ross looked around at the children's eager faces, at the adults who no longer crossed the street to avoid him, at the life he was slowly building in this place that had once rejected him. Maybe it is. But change, as they were about to discover, rarely comes without resistance. The trouble started again in early February, when word reached Willow Creek that a group of Apache raiders had attacked a supply train 50 miles to the south. No one was seriously hurt, and the raiders had melted back into the desert before the cavalry could respond. But the incident was enough to rekindle old fears and prejudices. Harlan Briggs, who had been keeping a low profile since his humiliation outside the Monroe house, saw an opportunity to rally support for his cause. He began frequenting the saloons again, buying drinks for anyone willing to listen to his increasingly inflammatory speeches about the Indian problem. Mark my words. He would say, his voice slurred with whiskey, but his eyes sharp with calculation. It starts with one Apache in town, acting all peaceful and domesticated. But they're all the same underneath savages who can't be trusted. And when their blood brothers come calling, what do you think's gonna happen? You think that half-breed boy's gonna choose his white neighbors over his father's people? It was Doc Henley who brought word of Harlan's campaign to Ross. The two men had struck up an unlikely friendship over their shared interest in herbal medicine, and the doctor had come to respect the Apache's knowledge of traditional healing methods. "No, thought you should know," Doc said as they walked along the creek bank, ostensibly looking for medicinal plants, but really just talking. "Harlan's been stirring up trouble again. Nothing overt, mind you, but he's got some folks spooked." Ross nodded grimly. "I figured as much. People have been looking at me differently the past few days." "It's not everyone," Doc assured him. "Most folks have gotten used to having you around. But there's always a few who are ready to believe the worst, especially when someone like Harlan keeps poking at their fears." "What do you think I should do?" Doc was quiet for a moment, considering. "Part of me wants to say you should lay low, let this blow over. But another part thinks that's exactly the wrong approach. Running away just confirms their worst suspicions about you." "I won't run," Ross said firmly. "Not again. Whatever comes, I'll face it here." What came was a town meeting. Sheriff Cobb called it for the third Sunday in February, ostensibly to discuss improvements to the schoolhouse, but really to address the growing tension before it could explode into something uglier. The entire population of Willow Creek seemed to have crammed into the schoolhouse that afternoon. Men in their Sunday best, women clutching their handbags, children peering around their parents' legs to get a better view of the proceedings. Ross sat in the back with Dora and Jake, acutely aware of the whispers and stares directed their way. Jake, who had no understanding of the undercurrents swirling around them, waved cheerfully at his friends and seemed puzzled when some of them didn't wave back. Sheriff Cobb called the meeting to order and began with a few mundane announcements about road repairs and tax collections. But everyone knew what they were really there to discuss, and the tension in the room grew thicker with each passing minute. Finally, Harlan Briggs couldn't contain himself any longer. He rose from his seat near the front of the room, his face flushed with righteous indignation. "Sheriff, I appreciate all this talk about schoolhouses and such, but we all know why we're really here. We got us an Indian living in town, and now his people are on the warpath again. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room." A murmur ran through the crowd, some agreeing, others protesting, all of them turning to stare at Ross and his family. Jake pressed closer to his mother, finally beginning to sense that something was wrong. Sheriff Cobb sighed. "Harlan, we've been through this before. Ross Nez hasn't caused any trouble in this town. In fact, he's been a model citizen." "The model citizen." Harlan's voice rose to a shout. "He's an Apache. His people are murdering and pillaging not 50 miles from here, and you want to call him a model citizen?" "His people?" came a new voice from the middle of the room. "Include my daughter and grandson." Robert Monroe stood slowly, his imposing figure commanding attention. The room fell silent as he looked around at his neighbors and business associates, many of whom owed their prosperity to his investments and guidance. "Some of you have known me for 30 years. Robert continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "You've trusted me with your money, your businesses, your futures. Have I ever steered you wrong?" A few heads shook in the negative. Robert nodded and continued. "Then trust me now when I tell you that Ross Nez is not our enemy. He's a father who loves his son, a man who's trying to build a life in a place that hasn't always welcomed him. If we turn our backs on him now, if we let fear and prejudice drive out a good man, then we're no better than the savages we claim to despise. It was perhaps the longest speech Robert Monroe had ever made in public, and its impact was immediate. Several people nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful. But Harlan wasn't finished. "Pretty words, Mr. Monroe," he sneered. "But what happens when his Apache friends come calling? What happens when they want him to guide them to our homes, our businesses, our families? You gonna trust him then?" Before Robert could respond, Ross himself stood up. The room fell completely silent as he walked to the front, every eye following his tall, imposing figure. When he turned to face the crowd, his expression was calm, but his eyes held depths that spoke of pain and determination. "My name is Ross Nez." He began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I am Apache, yes. I was born on the reservation, raised to hunt and fight and follow the old ways. But I am also the father of a 7-year-old boy who calls Willow Creek home. I am the son-in-law of Robert and Margaret Monroe, whether they want to claim me or not. And I am a man who has chosen to make his life here among you, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where my family is." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Some of you are afraid that I'll choose my Apache brothers over my white neighbors if trouble comes. I understand that fear. But let me ask you this. If strangers came to your town and threatened your child, whose side would you choose? The strangers who share your blood, or the neighbors who share your child's life?" A woman near the front, Mrs. Abernathy, the seamstress, spoke up. "But they're your people, aren't they? Your blood?" Ross nodded. "They are. Just as white men who rob banks and murder innocents are your blood. Does that make you responsible for their actions? Does that make you untrustworthy?" The comparison hit home with several people in the crowd. Heads began to nod, and the hostile murmur that had been building started to fade. But Harlan wasn't giving up. "Fine words," he spat. "But when push comes to shove, blood tells. And his blood runs Apache." "His blood," said a young voice from the back of the room, "runs in me too." Every head turned to see Jake Monroe walking down the aisle toward the front of the room. His small face was set with determination beyond his years, and his dark eyes, so like his father's, blazed with quiet fury. "Jake," Dora called softly, but the boy shook his head. "No, Mama. I want to say something." He stopped beside his father and looked out at the crowd of adults, many of whom had known him since birth. "My pa's Apache, and I'm proud of that. He taught me to track animals and read the weather and listen to what the mountains are saying. He saved me from wolves, and he's never told me a lie or broken a promise. If you think he's bad just because he's Indian, then you think I'm bad too, because I'm half Indian." The simple, honest words from a child's lips had more impact than any adult speech could have managed. Several women in the crowd were wiping their eyes, and even some of the men looked uncomfortable with their own prejudices. Jake wasn't finished. "Mr. Briggs, you said mean things about my mama and called me names. Pa could have hurt you for that, but he didn't, because that's not who he is. He's good and kind, and he loves me and Mama more than anything. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The schoolhouse was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. Harlan Briggs looked around at the faces surrounding him and saw his support crumbling. Even his closest allies seemed uncomfortable now, unwilling to maintain their hostility in the face of a child's innocent defense of his father. Sheriff Cobb cleared his throat. "Well, I think young Jake has said what needed saying. Does anyone else have anything to add?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Doc Henley stood up. "I've gotten to know Ross Nez over the past few months," he said. "He's taught me more about healing plants than I learned in 4 years of medical school. He's helped track down old Mrs. Patterson's lost cow, and he fixed the widow Mackenzie's roof without being asked. If we're going to judge a man, let's judge him by his actions, not his ancestry." Other voices began to join in tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. People stood up to recount small kindnesses Ross had done, help he'd offered, the way he'd transformed from a stranger into a neighbor. One by one, Harlan's supporters fell silent until he stood alone in his hatred. When the meeting ended, people lined up to shake Ross's hand and ruffle Jake's hair. The crisis had passed, but more than that, it had become a moment of genuine community acceptance. Only Harlan Briggs remained bitter and unreconciled. As the crowd dispersed, he cornered Ross outside the schoolhouse. "Now this ain't over." He hissed, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You think you've won something here, but you haven't. I know what you are, Apache. I know what you're capable of. And one day when you show your true colors, I'll be there to say, I told you so." Ross looked at him with something approaching pity. "I'm sorry for you, Harlan. I'm sorry that hate has eaten away so much of your heart that there's no room left for anything else. I don't want your pity, Indian." "Then what do you want?" For a moment, Harlan seemed at a loss for words. His face worked through a series of emotions, rage, frustration, and underneath it all, a pain so old and deep it had fossilized into permanent bitterness. "I want—" he began, then stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I want things to be the way they were before. Before you came back. Before she chose you over." The unfinished sentence hung in the air between them. And suddenly, Ross understood. This wasn't really about race or politics or tribal loyalties. This was about a man who had loved a woman and lost her to someone else whose wounded pride had festered into something toxic and destructive. "She was never yours to lose, Harlan," Ross said gently. "And hatred won't bring back what you never had." Harlan's face contorted with fury. But before he could respond, Jake appeared at his father's elbow. "Pa, Mama says we should go home now. Grandma's making pie." The simple domestic detail seemed to drain all the fight out of Harlan. He looked at the boy, then at Ross, then at the lights of Willow Creek twinkling in the gathering dusk. Without another word, he turned and walked away into the darkness. Ross watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He had a feeling they hadn't seen the last of Harlan Briggs, but for tonight at least, his family was safe. "Come on, son," he said, taking Jake's hand. "Let's go home." Spring came early to Willow Creek that year, painting the hills green and filling the air with the scent of wildflowers. For the first time since Ross's return, the family felt truly settled. Jake was thriving, growing taller and more confident with each passing day. His unique heritage, once a source of whispers and stares, had become simply part of who he was, the boy with the Apache father, who could track a deer through snow and predict the weather by watching the clouds. Dora had taken a job helping Margaret Monroe with her charity work, organizing fundraisers for the new church, and coordinating aid for families hit by the harsh winter. The work gave her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, and the respect she earned from the other women in town helped heal some of the wounds left by years of social isolation. Ross, meanwhile, had found his own place in the community. His skills as a tracker and outdoorsman were in constant demand. Ranchers hired him to find lost cattle. The sheriff called on him to track down missing persons. And hunters sought his guidance in the high country. He was building a reputation as a man who could be trusted, and slowly but surely, the barriers between him and the white community were coming down. It was during this peaceful time that Dora finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her heart for months. They were sitting on the porch of the old line shack, where Ross still made his home, watching Jake practice with the small bow his father had made for him. The boy's aim was improving, and he'd managed to hit the target Ross had carved into an old tree stump 3 times in a row. "Ross," Dora said quietly, "do you ever think about making this permanent?" He looked at her, not quite understanding. "Making what permanent?" "This, us, our family." She gestured toward Jake, who was whooping with delight at his latest successful shot. "I know we can't undo the past, and I know there are still people in town who will never fully accept what we are. But Jake deserves to have both his parents. And She hesitated, then forged ahead. I never stopped loving you, Ross. Even when I hated you for leaving, even when I convinced myself I was better off alone, I never stopped loving you. Ross was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on his son. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I've been afraid to ask for too much, he said. Afraid that if I pushed for more than you were willing to give, I might lose what little I have. But yes, Dora, I want to make it permanent. I want to marry you if you'll have me. I want to give Jake the kind of home he deserves, with both his parents under the same roof. And I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the years I lost. Dora felt tears sting her eyes. Are you asking me to marry you, Ross Nez? He slid off his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her hands in his calloused grip. I'm asking you to marry me, Dora Monroe. I'm asking you to let me be the husband I should have been 7 years ago, and the father Jake has always deserved. I'm asking you to trust me with your heart one more time, and I swear on everything I hold sacred that I won't break it again. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, yes, yes. Jake looked up from his archery practice to see his parents embracing, and his whoop of joy echoed across the hills. Does this mean Pa's gonna live with us all the time now? If that's all right with you, Ross said, ruffling his son's hair. It's perfect, Jake declared. Now I can show everyone at school that I really do have the best Pa in the whole world. The wedding took place on a beautiful Saturday in May, with half the town in attendance. Reverend Mills, who had initially been reluctant to perform the ceremony, had been won over by Robert Monroe's not-so-subtle hints about the size of his weekly donations. The service was simple but heartfelt, with Jake serving as ring-bearer and Margaret Monroe crying tears of joy throughout the entire ceremony. Even Sheriff Cobb was there, along with Doc Henley and most of the other townspeople who had come to accept Ross as one of their own. The notable exception was Harlan Briggs, who had left town the week before, reportedly heading west to try his luck in the California goldfields. As Ross and Dora exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause, and Jake's cheer was the loudest of all. At the reception in the church hall, Robert Monroe stood up to make a toast. The old man had to wait for the room to quiet down before he could speak, and when he did, his voice was thick with emotion. 7 years ago, he began, I thought I knew what was best for my daughter. I thought I could protect her from hardship and heartache by forcing her to choose between her family and the man she loved. I was wrong. He looked directly at Ross. I've watched you these past months, son. I've seen how you care for my daughter and grandson, how you've worked to earn the respect of this community, how you've proven that a man's character matters more than the color of his skin or the language his ancestors spoke. I'm proud to call you my son-in-law, and I'm grateful that my grandson will grow up with a father who knows what it means to be a man of honor. The room erupted in applause again, and Ross felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey he'd been sipping. For the first time in his adult life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift home, Ross and Dora stood together on the church steps, watching Jake chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The boys' laughter echoed across the town square, a sound of pure joy that seemed to encapsulate everything they had fought for and won. No regrets? Ross asked softly, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. None, Dora replied, leaning into his embrace. This is exactly how it was supposed to be. Jake ran up to them, and then his face flushed with excitement and exertion. Pa-ma, look. He held up a mason jar with 3 fireflies glowing inside. I caught them. That's wonderful, son, Ross said. Now what are you going to do with them? Jake looked at the jar thoughtfully, watching the tiny creatures flash their lights against the glass. "I think I'll let them go," he said finally. "They're prettier when they're free." He unscrewed the lid and watched as the fireflies rose into the star-filled sky, their lights blinking like tiny beacons of hope. Ross tightened his arm around Dora and felt a sense of completion that he'd never expected to experience again. They were home. Epilogue. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening. Much like the one when Ross had first saved Jake from the wolves, the family rode together up into the foothills above Willow Creek. Jake, now 12 and growing tall like his father, sat easily in the saddle of his own horse, a paint pony that Ross had trained for him. Dora rode beside her husband, her face peaceful and content in the golden light of sunset. They were heading to a special place Ross had discovered during his years of wandering, a hidden meadow high in the mountains where wildflowers grew in profusion and a clear stream bubbled down from the peaks. It was here that Ross had come to think and remember during the lonely years after he'd left Dora. Now he wanted to share it with his family, to make new memories in a place that had once held only sorrow. As they crested the final ridge and the meadow spread out before them, Jake let out a whistle of appreciation. "Pa, this is beautiful. How come you never brought us here before?" "I was saving it for the right time," Ross replied. "And this feels like the right time." They dismounted and let the horses graze while they spread a blanket near the stream. Dora unpacked the picnic basket Margaret had prepared for them, and they ate cold chicken and biscuits while watching the sun sink toward the western peaks. "Tell me again about the wolves, Pa," Jake said, stretching out on the blanket with his head pillowed on his arms. Ross smiled. His son never tired of hearing that story, and Ross never tired of telling it. But tonight, for some reason, he found himself focusing on a different part of the tale. The wolves weren't really the important part, he said thoughtfully. The important part was what came after. The choice your mother and I had to make about whether to try again, whether to trust each other with our hearts, even though we'd both been hurt before. "And you chose to trust," Jake said. It wasn't a question, he'd heard this part before too. "We chose to trust," Ross confirmed. "And we chose to fight for our family, even when it would have been easier to walk away." Jake was quiet for a moment, then sat up and looked at his parents with the serious expression he sometimes wore when grappling with ideas too big for his young mind. "I'm glad the wolves came," he said finally. Ross raised an eyebrow. "You're glad you were almost eaten by wild animals." "Oh, well, no," Jake said with a grin. "But if they hadn't come, you might not have found me. And if you hadn't found me, you might not have found Ma again. And if you hadn't found Ma again, we wouldn't be a family." Dora reached over and ruffled her son's hair. "That's very wise, Jake Monroe-Nez." Jake beamed at the use of his hyphenated surname, a compromise he'd suggested himself when his parents married. He was proud of both sides of his heritage and saw no reason to choose between them. As full darkness settled over the meadow and the first stars began to appear, Ross built a small fire, and they sat around it talking and laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. Jake peppered his father with questions about the constellations, while Dora listened with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. When Jake finally fell asleep, curled up in a blanket beside the dying fire, Ross and Dora sat together in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined. "Do you ever wonder how different things might have been?" Dora asked softly. "If you hadn't left, if we'd married when we were young?" Ross considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about all the things we learned during those years apart. The strength you found raising Jake alone, the wisdom I gained wandering in the wilderness, the way we both had to grow up and figure out who we really were before we could build something lasting together." He squeezed her hand. "Maybe we needed those years apart to become the people we needed to be for each other." "Maybe," Dora agreed. Or maybe I'm just too happy to regret anything that brought us to this moment. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the peaceful sounds of the night. Finally, Ross spoke again. "There's something I want to show you tomorrow," he said. "Something I've been working on." "What kind of something?" Ross smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." The next morning, after they'd ridden back down to Willow Creek and Jake had run off to play with his friends, Ross led Dora to a piece of land about a mile outside of town. It was a beautiful spot, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, a creek running along one edge, and a view of the mountains that took her breath away. "Ross, this is lovely, but what?" Dora stopped mid-sentence as she saw what was rising from the center of the property. The frame of a house larger than any they'd ever lived in, with a wraparound porch and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. "I've been working on it in my spare time," Ross said, suddenly nervous. "I wanted to surprise you. I thought maybe it was time we had a real home. Our own place where Jake can bring his friends, and you can have your sewing circle, and we can—" He trailed off, watching her face anxiously. Dora was speechless. She walked slowly toward the house frame, running her hands along the smooth wood, imagining walls and rooms, and the life they would build here together. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's absolutely perfect." Ross came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Are you sure? I know it's presumptuous starting without asking you, but I wanted to have something concrete to show you. Something that proved I'm not going anywhere this time." Dora turned in his arms and kissed him deeply. "I love it," she said against his lips. "I love you. And I love the life we're building together." As they stood there in the morning sun, surrounded by the bones of their future home, they could hear Jake's voice calling to them from across the meadow. He was running toward them, his face bright with excitement, probably bursting to tell them about some adventure he'd had with his friends. Ross and Dora smiled at each other and walked out to meet their son. Their hands joined their hearts, full of love and hope and gratitude for the long, winding road that had brought them home to each other at last. In the distance, the Sacramento Mountains rose majestically against the blue sky, their peaks touched with snow even in summer. Somewhere in those mountains, Ross had once been a young man running from love and responsibility. Somewhere in the town below, Dora had once been a young woman facing shame and hardship alone. But that was the past. This was now a family together, a community that had learned to see beyond the surface differences to the love that bound them all. This was home, not because of the place they stood, but because of the people they stood with. And as Jake reached them and threw his arms around both his parents, chattering excitedly about his morning adventures, Ross knew with absolute certainty that some stories really do have happy endings. They just take a little longer to write than most.